Grace's life in the small village of Greenfield was peaceful. Her parents, John and Mary, raised her with love and instilled values of honesty and hard work. The village elders often shared stories that taught the younger generation about life, using proverbs and mythological creatures. One elder, Old Matthew, warned that the world beyond the village was filled with unseen dangers. Despite the warnings, Grace dreamed of exploring the world. One day, tragedy struck. Both of Grace's parents fell gravely ill. The village healer, despite his best efforts, couldn't save them. Grace was left orphaned, and the villagers began to distance themselves, whispering that she was cursed. Old Matthew tried to console her, but his words of wisdom were not enough to quell her grief. The weight of loss became unbearable. Desperate for answers, Grace sought the advice of Old Matthew. He told her, "The wind that blows from the city brings wealth but carries sorrow with it." He warned her of the dangers of greed and corruption in the city. Still, Grace felt that staying in the village with no family and no future was unbearable. Grace made the difficult decision to leave her village behind. She packed what little she had and set out on foot, following the road that led to the city of Brightwater. Her heart was heavy, but she hoped the city would offer her a chance to rebuild her life. As she left, she heard Old Matthew's voice in her mind, "The snake in the grass may seem harmless, but its bite comes when you least expect." The journey to Brightwater was long and treacherous. Grace walked for days, facing hunger, fatigue, and even wild animals. Along the way, she met a trickster named Ben, who offered her food and shelter in exchange for a favor. Grace, not yet wise to the ways of the city, trusted him. Ben took advantage of her kindness, leaving her with nothing. She realized that not everyone could be trusted. Brightwater was unlike anything Grace had ever seen. The towering buildings, the constant noise, and the sheer number of people overwhelmed her. She wandered the streets, searching for a place to stay, but everywhere was filled with bustling crowds and cold indifference. Grace quickly realized that the city was no place for the weak or unprepared. With no money or connections, Grace began sleeping in unfinished buildings and abandoned shops. She scavenged for food and tried to stay out of trouble. Each night, she dreamt of her village and the warmth of her parents' home. The reality of the city was harsh, and her spirit began to break. One day, while searching for food in a marketplace, Grace caught the attention of Mrs. Williams, a middle-aged woman who owned a canteen. Mrs. Williams offered Grace a job, providing her with food and shelter in exchange for work. Grace, desperate and grateful, accepted the offer, thinking she had finally found her lifeline. Grace quickly adapted to life at the canteen. She served food, washed dishes, and became a familiar face to the customers. For the first time since arriving in the city, she felt a sense of stability. But there was something unsettling about Mrs. Williams. Grace noticed how the woman treated her wealthier customers with extra care and whispered in dark corners. Grace overheard a disturbing conversation between Mrs. Williams and a customer one night. The man was asking for more than just food, and Mrs. Williams seemed all too willing to oblige. A chill ran down Grace's spine. She realized that the canteen wasn't just about serving meals, there was something far more sinister going on behind the scenes. Mrs. Williams, who had appeared to be a savior, began revealing her true colors. She suggested that Grace could make more money by entertaining some of her wealthier clients. At first, Grace refused, but Mrs. Williams applied pressure, reminding her that without the canteen, Grace would have nothing. Under duress, Grace eventually gave in. Her first encounter with one of Mrs. Williams' customers was devastating. She felt violated and betrayed, not only by Mrs. Williams but also by the city she had once hoped would offer her a new life. The shame and guilt weighed heavily on her heart. Soon, Grace found herself trapped in a vicious cycle. Mrs. Williams would send her to more clients, and Grace, powerless and afraid, complied. She felt her soul slipping away, and the dreams of a better life faded into nothingness. She became a shadow of the hopeful girl she once was. Grace encountered different kinds of men, businessmen, politicians, and criminals. Each man was more ruthless than the last. She realized how deep the corruption in the city ran and how many people profited from others' misery. She was just another pawn in their game. As Grace's spirit continued to deteriorate, she began questioning her decision to leave the village. The city's false promises had lured her in, but it had only given her pain and suffering in return. She longed to go back, but it was too late. She had nowhere to turn. One day, a mysterious old woman named Nana Alice visited the canteen. She sensed Grace's pain and whispered a prophecy: the city can take what the heart holds dear, but only the strong can take it back. Grace didn't understand the meaning of her words, but they stayed with her. Soon after, Grace began to fall ill. She was constantly fatigued, feverish, and weak. She visited a local clinic, where the doctor delivered the heartbreaking news: she had contracted HIV. The diagnosis crushed her, and Grace felt as though the city had completely consumed her. Her illness became more than a physical ailment, it was a plague on her spirit. Grace grew resentful of Mrs. Williams and the men who had used her. She realized that her life had been stolen from her, and her thoughts turned dark. Revenge began to take root in her heart. Fueled by anger and the knowledge of her illness, Grace began plotting her revenge. She observed Mrs. Williams closely, learning her habits and routines. Grace knew that she had been wronged in the worst way, and she was determined to make Mrs. Williams pay for what she had done. Grace played her part well, pretending to be compliant and obedient. Mrs. Williams believed she had broken Grace completely, but behind her silence, Grace's plan was slowly coming together. She gathered information, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Grace started to listen carefully to Mrs. Williams' conversations with her wealthiest clients. She learned of their illegal dealings and began keeping notes. Mrs. Williams had no idea that Grace was slowly building a case against her. Grace visited an old street peddler named Uncle Fred, who sold herbs and potions. She asked for a specific poison, something that would kill quickly and leave no trace. Uncle Fred warned her of the dangers of vengeance, but Grace was resolute. Another night brought another humiliation at the hands of a customer. This time, Grace decided she had had enough. Her hatred for Mrs. Williams reached a boiling point. The next event at the canteen would be the night she exacted her revenge. Mrs. Williams hosted a grand celebration for her most important clients. The air was filled with laughter and music, but Grace was focused on her mission. She prepared Mrs. Williams' favorite drink, carefully lacing it with the poison. Mrs. Williams raised her glass to toast her success, completely unaware of what was about to happen. Grace watched with a cold, steady gaze as Mrs. Williams drank from the poison cup. The clock was ticking, it didn't take long. Mrs. Williams suddenly gasped for air, clutching her throat. The room erupted in chaos as she collapsed to the ground, writhing in pain. Grace felt a dark satisfaction wash over her as she watched her tormentor's final moments. The authorities were called, and Mrs. Williams' death was ruled suspicious. Grace tried to act as though she had nothing to do with it, but guilt gnawed at her insides. Despite her feelings of vengeance, the weight of what she had done began to sink in. A few days after the incident, the police arrived at the canteen. Grace was arrested and charged with murder. She remained silent as they took her away, her heart heavy with a mixture of fear and defiance. She had wanted revenge, but now she had to face the consequences. In court, Grace's case drew public attention. People debated whether she was a victim or a villain. The media painted her as a cold-blooded killer, but those who knew her story saw her as a tragic figure caught in a web of corruption and exploitation. Grace was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of Mrs. Williams. The verdict was no surprise to her. As the judge read the sentence, Grace felt a strange sense of peace. Her journey had led her to this point, and though her body was imprisoned, her spirit felt strangely free. Grace was transferred to a women's prison, where she quickly realized that life behind bars was just as harsh as the outside world. The prison was filled with women from all walks of life, some innocent, some guilty, but all broken in their own ways. In prison, Grace met Aunt Margaret, an older woman who had been incarcerated for decades. Aunt Margaret was wise, having survived the harsh realities of prison life. She took Grace under her wing, offering her guidance and teaching her how to find peace within herself. Aunt Margaret shared stories from her own life, teaching Grace about the power of forgiveness. She told Grace that holding on to hatred only imprisoned the soul further. Grace struggled with this idea, but the seeds of redemption began to take root in her heart. One day, Grace received a letter from old Matthew, the village elder. He had heard of her arrest and wrote to remind her of the village's teachings. He spoke of the snake that had bitten her, but also of the possibility of healing. His words brought tears to Grace's eyes. Grace began sharing her story with other inmates. She told them about her journey from the village to the city, about the betrayal, and about the poison she used to kill Mrs. Williams. The women listened in rapt attention, and soon, Grace's story became a form of folklore within the prison walls. At night, Grace was visited by dreams of her parents and the village elders. They spoke to her in riddles and proverbs, guiding her toward a path of redemption. Grace began to embrace the spirituality of her ancestors, seeking their wisdom in her moments of doubt. Grace slowly came to understand the power of forgiveness. She realized that while she had sought revenge on Mrs. Williams, it had not brought her the peace she had hoped for. Forgiveness, she learned, was the only way to truly free herself from the chains of her past. Grace found a new purpose within the prison walls. She began organizing storytelling circles with the other women, helping them to share their own stories of pain and survival. Through this, Grace found healing and redemption. Grace's story began to gain attention outside the prison. Journalists and activists took an interest in her case, seeing it as a symbol of the struggles faced by women in the city. Grace, however, was less interested in the media attention and more focused on helping her fellow inmates. One day, Grace received a visit from a lawyer who believed in her story. He told her that there might be a chance to appeal her case. Grace was hesitant, not sure if she deserved freedom, but the possibility of redemption outside the prison walls was a glimmer of hope. Grace's lawyer filed an appeal, arguing that she had been a victim of exploitation and abuse. The court proceedings were long and difficult, but Grace's story began to resonate with people. Public opinion shifted in her favor. Grace was visited by old Matthew, who had traveled from Greenfield to see her. He reminded her of the village's teachings and told her that forgiveness and redemption were still possible, even after everything she had been through. Grace had a dream in which a snake slithered toward her, but instead of biting, it shed its skin and transformed into a bird. Grace interpreted this as a sign that she could shed her past and find a new path forward. In another dream, Grace's parents appeared to her, speaking in riddles about the choices she had made. They told her that revenge had only brought her more pain, but that there was still time to make things right. Grace continued to lead storytelling circles in the prison. The women shared their stories of hardship and survival, and through these stories, Grace found strength. She realized that her life, though filled with pain, could still have meaning. Grace's appeal was heard in court. Her lawyer argued that she had been a victim of systemic abuse, and the judge took this into consideration. Grace spoke in her own defense, using proverbs and stories from her village to explain her actions. The court reduced Grace's sentence, but instead of being overjoyed, Grace felt conflicted. She had found purpose in prison, helping the other women. She wasn't sure if she wanted to leave just yet. Her journey toward redemption was not yet complete. Grace continued to be haunted by memories of the canteen and the people she had hurt. She knew that in order to truly find peace, she had to confront this ghost and find a way to forgive herself. Grace's story became a legend within the prison. The women told and retold her story, using it as a lesson about the dangers of revenge and the power of forgiveness. Grace realized that her legacy would live on through these stories. As an old woman, Grace sat with the younger inmates, telling them one final story, the story of a girl who sought revenge but found wisdom instead. As her words echoed in the air, Grace felt a sense of peace. She had finally found redemption.